So this is our program for the week of February 24th, 2025. We've been hearing a lot in the media about the status of the ceasefire, but in reality, we're not really dealing with one. The first phase is essentially a temporary and very fragile truce that requires Israel and Hamas to get past this first phase of hostage releases in order to ensure that they can move into discussions of more lasting cessation of hostilities. One of the things that we know as of today is that talks are underway in Egypt right now over phase two. And there's a lot of unknowns at this point. And there have been some major hiccups, namely around the hostage releases. But they've happened, and hundreds of prisoners have been released, and hostages and the remains of deceased hostages have been returned. But one of the reasons why we're talking about Israel and Hamas negotiating phase two or maybe an extension of phase one, depending on which side's perspective you're speaking from, just now a day before the stated deadline to end phase one and move into phase two, is that Israel has refused to actually engage in talks for there to be a plan for phase two, which, needless to say, would have had to start weeks ago for it to not seem like it could all fall apart in an instant. So let's talk a little bit about the hostage releases, because again, they've happened and that's noteworthy. And the idea was to ensure that over the last several weeks, there would be a release of Israeli hostages for hundreds of Palestinians who've been kept often without any charge in administrative detention. One of the biggest stumbling blocks was what happened last Saturday when Israel was due to release 600 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for Hamas's release of six hostages, but Israel decided unilaterally that it wouldn't do that, which was a clear violation of the ceasefire agreement. And that, again, put everything in peril. And their justification was that Israel was pissed off about what they consider propaganda ceremonies for the hostage releases. And there's video of these online. I have a photo here of one of them and a pretty indelible image that I'll talk about in a minute. Um, Now, it's not entirely clear what Hamas wanted to do by making the prisoner releases more than just a formal exchange. Their particular motivations are speculative at this point. But that became Netanyahu's pretext for violating the exchange agreement under phase one. And it's important to say that even if Hamas having the prisoners on stage and parading them in public before the release was, as the UN and other international agencies have alluded to, a potential mistreatment of those prisoners, they were still released, which meant that Hamas was upholding its end of the exchange bargain. But Israel, again, as I repeated before, decided not to, and that delay, and now the subsequent delay in negotiations on phase two, appears to be consistent with the strategy to put off, perhaps permanently, the prospect of a lasting cessation of hostilities. This photo that I just mentioned of one of the Israeli prisoners, Omer Shev Tam, kissing several of his Hamas captors on their head. If you haven't seen it, it's worth taking a look at online. It's not hard to find. Um, while he's smiling during one of the ceremonies is perhaps one of the more memorable images that spurred this controversy over the exchanges last week, with Israeli news outlets and government sources reporting that the kiss was coerced, and reaction among Arab social media and the general public, international public, indicating or alluding to the fact that this might be a sign of some crumbling Israeli propaganda around what Hamas is, and a sign of benevolence. I don't think it's easy to make to say exactly what Hamas's motivations were here, but this is also somewhat consistent with what we've seen in the past, where some of the captors have been given sort of friendly gestures by Israeli prisoners upon their release, and Israeli politicians have reacted strongly in the negative. And there was also this controversy in Israel about the return of the remains of an Israeli mother and her two small children who were captured on October 7th. Hamas claims that they were killed by Israeli airstrikes in November of 2023, and Israel's military has made the sensational claim that the children were actually, quote, killed by Hamas soldiers with their bare hands. Again, it's worthy and important and ongoing analysis. to examine the endless propaganda war here, and its influence on every phase of manufacturing consent for Israeli public policy. And of course, there's something here to be analyzed in terms of Arab support for Hamas as well. But we know it's difficult to parse through these claims when there's journalism is prevented from, penetrating uh, into, what's actually happened and transpired in Israel and with these hostage releases. And we also know that Israel's claims of and accusations of barbaric behavior against Hamas on October 7th were used to justify its genocidal war, even when those claims were uh, debunked or failed to materialize, like the claims of mass rapes. Um, I think, regardless, the important takeaway here is that the truth about what happened to these prisoner hostages, rather on and how they were killed, is that there's this constantly jockeying between uh, Israeli politicians and media on the right in Israel to keep the Israeli public and the Western world distrustful of Hamas and by association Palestinians writ large, as a form of leverage in manipulating the peace process to their advantage. Now, of course, ultimately, and it's something else to note here is that with the Bibas family, that in fact um, Netanyahu did go to some lengths to describe with some detail the deaths of the children, and they made public demands. I think with one of the family members telling Netanyahu to shut up and not use them publicly in the propaganda war that is a kind of a constant drumbeat around the peace negotiations. Now, again, the good news is that Hamas did agree to hand over 4 bodies of hostages to the Red Cross and away from the cameras in a subsequent release, which then resulted in 642 Palestinian prisoners being released this week, including 46 of whom were women or minors. And among those released was Nael Barghouti, who is the longest serving Palestinian political prisoner until his release. And there's a short little profile of him in the Palestine Chronicle that's worth checking out if you want to get a sense of what someone like Nael has endured, being in and out of detention for years on end. And again, we don't have the links as ready as possible. I think if Annie is trying to get them over, it's probably because she's having to search for them, but that's because we're a little bit less prepared than normal. So we'll try to send everything over in our follow-up email, and just bear with us. Um, so again, hostages are going to continue to be a big part of whether and how the ceasefire advances to a second phase or whether it collapses altogether. The second phase was intended to cover the release of all remaining hostages and the removal of Israeli forces from Gaza. But what's happened in phase one is obviously a sign of how treacherous the talks are going with Israel, which has not only violated the terms of phase one by initially withholding its own hostages, i.e., Palestinian prisoners in administrative detention, but it's also been violating the terms of the ceasefire in a bunch of different ways. And these articles in Al Jazeera and in Mondo Weiss lay out some of those violations and how they pertain to the ongoing successive peace talks at the moment, especially heading into this short period of time before the phase one period expires on Saturday. So again, we mentioned hostages. Let's talk about some of the other violations. According to the ceasefire agreement, Israel was supposed to let in 600 trucks of aid per day. And I think a couple weeks ago, Samar laid out a little bit of Hamas's, initial problems with what was going on, including the lack of trucks entering into Gaza with aid. Um, and there are 50 fuel trucks and a total of 200,000 tents and 60,000 prefabricated mobile homes that were supposed to be delivered during the first phase of the ceasefire. Um, and I'm just noticing that I did not, give me 1 second. I noticed I did not give any privileges to share the material. So let me do that again. Uh, Bear with us today. Sorry about that, Annie. No, she's no worries. Thanks for letting me know. Um, And the Gaza government media office said that Israel has only let in 8,500 trucks out of the total 12,000. And in northern Gaza, only about 3,000, so less than half of the 6,000 that were intended, including the number of tents, and they've only let in a handful of mobile homes. So Gaza is still in an unlivable state of disrepair, which is obviously a clear way of continuing to push Palestinians towards forcible removal from the region altogether, and it's consistent with an ethnic cleansing program, or what Israel has been euphemistically calling voluntary immigration. And if you recall, at the beginning of this month, the failure to meet aid conditions was part of why Hamas initially suspended its releases of hostages earlier in this month. And then, of course, they resumed them again. And again, if you look at this graphic from earlier this month, this is from February 11th, you see why that initial suspension of hostages releases took place. Israel was blocking heavy equipment that's needed to remove rubble and rebuild homes. It was blocking aid and medical treatment. And of course, most poignantly, Israel has still been killing Gazans during the ceasefire period, including with airstrikes, including one from yesterday in Rafah. Now, one key aspect for moving ceasefire negotiations into a second phase is the withdrawal of troops from certain regions in and around Gaza. And a few weeks ago, Israel withdrew its troops from the Netzarim corridor, which is a 4-mile strip of land that Israel set up within weeks of the war, and used as a military zone during the fighting. Uh, Phase two was going to require Israel to withdraw from the Philadelphia corridor in the south between Gaza and Egypt. And according to the ceasefire agreement, that withdrawal is supposed to start this weekend, and then should be completed by the end of next week. Um, Now, again, a lot of things are up in the air. There's a lot of news still coming out about where these talks are headed in Egypt. But Israel is already balking at the idea of having those troops removed from the Philadelphia corridor, which again is setting us up for some breakdown in talks to succeed at this second phase. And as of this week, Israeli officials have publicly said that they won't leave the corridor and have claimed it's because this is some sort of major entry point of arms and supplies to Hamas. And what's interesting about this ABC News article is that it details some of the longstanding internal tensions in the Israeli military and government about the corridor. Yoav Gallant, as some of you may remember, was the former defense secretary for a large stretch of the initial period of the genocide, and also the former chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces, Hervi Halevi, both publicly stated that Israel doesn't actually need to stay in the corridor for its security interest, and that remaining in the corridor or not shouldn't be a stumbling block to completing a ceasefire deal. And on the other hand, Netanyahu and obviously members of the far right parties have re-emphasized otherwise, and Netanyahu himself has long said that Israeli control there is a core security interest for national as a core interest for Israel's national security, and he's called it a quote oxygen valve for Hamas that he wants to shut off. Where does this leave things? As far as I can tell, with some significant uncertainty, given how important this is for Hamas, which is considered management of the corridor a red line, and has refused previous agreements that didn't involve Israel relinquishing control of the Philadelphia corridor. So then, we have to wonder about what this weekend's discussions will look like. And Israel has said that they want a first phase plus, or some sort of extension of this truce period in phase one. Uh, and without an Israeli withdrawal of forces from the corridor. Israel wants to continue exchanges of hostages and prisoners, um, ostensibly until they get all the living hostages out of Gaza, and have proposed something like 3 per week in return for more Palestinian prisoners. But if that happens, and there's no ceasefire, they could just continue to agree to releasing more hostages, and um, that could just continue. They could just continue with the genocide and with their military operations in Gaza without a ceasefire. So Hamas is not likely to agree to releasing more hostages at this stage, because frankly, that's sort of a critical amount of their leverage in those discussions. Despite calls from Amnesty and other organizations to not have the hostages be points of leverage in the negotiations, I think the reality is that they're going to be, they have been, and I think how this plays out over the weekend will determine, whether or not we see any of those hostage releases in the near future again. Um, and I mean that on both sides, of course, with the hostages on the Israeli side being Palestinian prisoners, including those in administrative detention. So, Hamas is calling on the international community to ramp up pressure to move Israel into phase two. But again, until we hear that there have been some breakthroughs in the talks that are taking place right now, there's nothing to indicate that the bridge what exactly that bridge would be, because Hamas is not going to accept Israel's proposal to extend phase one by what I think is around 42 days and include hostage releases. And and of course, as I just mentioned, Israel already appears willing to violate the agreement further by continuing to occupy the Philadelphia corridor, which they are slated to, under the agreement, to exit from this coming week. So we're a little on pins and needles here. There's no plan in place that I know of or that I have seen. Should the ceasefire expire on Saturday night without a phase two plan with specifics? So this is something we should all be tracking over the next 24 to 48 hours, whether the talks in Egypt make a breakthrough or whether something short of Israel's extension of 42 days, but not quite a full agreement on phase two buys some time. That could be, some sort of tentative agreement for Israel to fulfill those obligations that we mentioned for humanitarian aid that it failed to fulfill under phase one, or something else, but it doesn't seem to be headed towards more hostage exchanges from what's being released publicly, at least on both sides. So, something else that's come up a bit over the last 2 weeks that's worth mentioning are remarks from Israeli authorities and also from Trump's liaison, the man who helped broker the initial ceasefire agreement, the real estate investor Steve Witkoff, that Hamas cannot, under any circumstances, play a role in future governance in Gaza. One of the senior Hamas leaders, Ismail Radwan, has publicly stated that Hamas is fine with deferring to the Palestinian national consensus on how to govern Gaza, but that Hamas won't, under any circumstances, submit to de-arming Hamas. And of course, why would they agree to any of Netanyahu's demands or the rhetoric of American politicians calling for de-arming Hamas? There's no reason at this point to trust them, and they have every reason, as Radwan mentions in this Mondo Weiss piece, to think that Netanyahu's violations are a way of sabotaging the peace process at this early phase, and also to continue with the plan of ethnic cleansing in Gaza and see it to its end. Now, something that's really interesting that came up on the Israeli side regarding governance of the region is the Yair Lapid day after plan. Lapid is the former Israeli prime minister and the leader of the opposition party in Israel, and he proposed a plan that once a ceasefire is secured, Egypt would take control of Gaza for at least 8 years and then potentially up to 15 years. Um, I would probably defer to Samer on the kind of credibility or reasonableness of this plan. It feels a little bit uh, unrealistic given what Egypt has said in the past. But in any event, his rationale was that Israel cannot agree to Hamas remaining in power, and the PA is not willing or able to manage Gaza in any time, in the near future, and obviously doesn't have credibility. And Israeli occupation, at least from his standpoint as a centrist, is not desirable or possible. And of course, a constant state of chaos, as he said, is both a security threat and a humanitarian disaster. Um, Now, Egypt hasn't officially responded to the proposal, but Saudi state-owned media have already reported that Egypt has rejected the plan or any attempts to involve them in administering Gaza long-term. Um, and it is true that the plan was presented by Lapid to Trump officials, but I think that this is part of the efforts to counterbalance Trump's wild remarks about fully expatriating Palestinians from Gaza and developing it like any number of his real estate properties into, as you all probably remember from a few weeks ago, a quote Riviera of the French Riviera of the Middle East. Um, Now, Arab leaders have also been meeting. They met last Friday to discuss a counterproposal to what Trump is considering, which calls for the establishment of a national Palestinian committee to administer Gaza. It would exclude Hamas, but it would facilitate international involvement in reconstruction efforts without forcing Palestinians to leave. And that committee would also operate independently of the Palestinian Authority, which again has very little credibility, including in the West Bank. Um, Now, again, I mentioned that Trump's wild sort of remarks about the future of Gaza. So speaking of Trump, I hope you didn't. So hopefully this is breaking news, but perhaps you did uh, hear about Trump's post on his own Truth Social. It's probably true that his emissary in these negotiations, Steve Witkoff, is actually trying to do something that's perhaps not as bizarre and outrageous as Trump is wont to say publicly or promote. But I think this week, Trump himself certainly set off alarms with the bizarre AI generated video, which shows a phenomenally and cartoonishly self-aggrandizing fantasy of Trump, complete with the statue and Trump Gaza hotels, having redeveloped Gaza into some bizarre luxury tourist destination, complete with some additionally disturbing AI images of him and Netanyahu and Musk half naked and frolicking on the beach. But I'll spare you having to watch it. But of course, it has been met with fierce condemnation by Palestinians and other members of the international community, and it should disturb all of us how glibly it proposes this sort of neo-colonial ethnic cleansing of Palestine at the behest of luxury hotels and the like. And that's all I'll say about it because it's pretty bizarre. There's at least one and probably many versions of AI responses by Palestinian folks and others mocking it, but I find all AI recreations unsettling. So if you think it's necessary to cleanse your palate by watching one of them, then have at it. I would say that what's important here is that the sitting president of the United States is once again platforming shoddy and deeply troubling propaganda that attempts to glorify ethnic cleansing and colonial occupation and luxury development that all of us need to oppose with every fiber of our being. A better a better ethnic, geez, a better palate cleanser is this conversation on Al Shabaka, which is a conversation on reconstructing Gaza. And if you really want it, something that's more meaningful, I'd suggest you check this out. It's kind of looking at what it will really take to reconstruct Gaza, both physically and politically, what role external actors would play in facilitating or obstructing that effort, and whether or not meaningful reconstruction could happen with a continued siege and occupation. Better use of your time, and I think it helps folks understand why the end game is so important to understanding how to navigate what Israel and the Trump administration are doing in the peace talks right now, and what really matters for sustaining Palestinian hopes for self-determination. Um, so again, yeah, a lot still to be said. I think this is a pivotal weekend. I do want to emphasize that there's a lot for us to keep track of this weekend and today. with regard to how ceasefire negotiations are going. And again, it's just not clear at this point from what's being reported what will come of one, those negotiations themselves, and if they're unable to reach an agreement by Saturday and the deadline, what that will mean in terms of Israel's actions, Hamas's actions, and then, of course, whether or not some sort of interim agreement can be reached to hold off a escalation of hostilities back to what we saw several months ago. Um, while let's talk about the West Bank. While Israel is doing whatever it can to make the ceasefire negotiations more difficult, including violations of the agreement itself, as we detailed, it's also engaged in a campaign in the West Bank that it claims is intended to root out militants, but is clearly being used to detain more Palestinians en masse and to displace them as well. Um, this week, the raids included rounding up people for interrogation in Hebron, Tulkarm, Kalkia, Nablus, Ramallah, Bethlehem, Jericho, and Tubas. So a lot of different places in the West Bank. And keep in mind, I think we mentioned this on the program a couple of weeks ago that this was starting about the same time as the ceasefire was put into place. And that this offensive in the West Bank has already seen 62 Palestinians killed and about 40,000 people evacuated from Jenin, Tulkarm, and Nusham's camps in the West Bank in just about a month. And across the camps, Israeli military have ripped up roads and destroyed buildings, infrastructure, and water and electricity lines. So clearly trying to make returning difficult, if not an impossibility. And I think this is a big deal. These are some of the poorest communities in the West Bank, and according to UNRWA, this is the largest scaled forced displacement of the West Bank since 1967, where some 250,000 Palestinians were forced from the West Bank when Israel seized the territory along with East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. And to add to it, I didn't include the article here. There's one in the New York Times, and if Annie's able to find it, it would be great. But we can include it in the follow-up email. There's an article today detailing the Palestinian Authority's role in trying to engage in the raids as well, but also complaining about Israeli military actions in blocking ambulances. And it all seems to amount to this further entrenchment of the deep-seated mistrust many Palestinians have about the PA as a corrupt regime that is complicit with Israel in the occupation. Um, and not coincidentally, Representative Brian Mast, who I think we've mentioned on this program before, he's a former IDF soldier and an out-and-out Zionist, and now the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House. He's made an official call on GOP staffers to now refer to the West Bank as Judea and Samaria, which is part of a series of efforts by Republican leaders to make this official through legislation and other efforts to create a quote unquote Friends of Judea and Samaria caucus, which is meant to promote Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank. This is just another explicit, gesture towards the Christian Zionist movement, which is certainly a major part of the Trump MAGA coalition now. And yeah, it's just biblically bad and something again in terms of efforts to mainstream far-right ideology into the public discourse and into diplomacy and foreign affairs. And I'm sure, this past week and even today, the bizarre things that this administration are doing to sort of mainstream far-right ideology will not cease to surprise all of us. So again, I tried my best to kind of get as much through this, but we have a couple more slides just to kind of get through just on a few other things I wanted to keep track of. You know, uh, I think the main thing from today, obviously, is going to be what happens this weekend with the ceasefire moving into next week, and whether or not phase two can be brought within reach. I think some of what I heard in prepping for this was, there are this mutual interest on both sides to at least extend it and avoid an escalation. I believe there's some sort of a budgetary vote. Don't quote me on this, but on that's happening within Israel that is a little bit of a limiter on Netanyahu's desire to re-escalate. And of course, as I'll get into, there are other fronts that Israel is operating on. And then it's also the holy month of Ramadan, and so certainly Hamas doesn't want and Palestinians in Gaza don't want to see an escalation under any circumstances, but particularly during this month. Um, so let's talk about two other fronts that again we would normally have several slides on both of these, but bear with me. But two other fronts just to mention, Lebanon and Syria. Israeli forces were slated to withdraw from southern Lebanon on February 18th, under that November 27th truce agreement, which had ended, over a year of fighting, including that 2 months of all-out war, in which Israel sent ground troops. And the Israeli Defense Minister, Katz, he said yesterday, I think, that Israeli forces would now indefinitely remain in what he called a buffer zone in southern Lebanon. And he had said earlier this month that they were planning to stay at 5 locations in Lebanon's southern region, even after the expiration of the extended deadline for Israel to withdraw under the ceasefire with Lebanon. Um, and he's calling it a buffer zone. And he also said that they received, quote, the green light from the United States to do it. And so it appears, Netanyahu's government has convinced Trump and his administration to allow them to keep some sort of long-term military presence in southern Lebanon. And I think that I think that's not welcome news. Certainly this in terms of occupation, but also in terms of whether or not Hezbollah will engage with Israel again in a escalated conflict. Obviously, Hezbollah's forces have been significantly impacted by the war, and I didn't include it, but I think this week was the sort of public commemoration of Hassan Nasrallah's life. I think tensions are certainly not in a great place, and it's something for us to keep track of, and also like another kind of front line in terms of how overextended Israel is at this moment, fighting on several fronts, and also with two peace agreements or ceasefire agreements hanging in the balance. Um, the other thing to mention is Syria, which is yet another front of Israel's overextended military campaign, and its occupation of southern Syria and its attacks there this week. The Israeli military said it struck sites in southern Syria on Tuesday of this week, and that was just a few hours after the new Syrian leadership demanded that Israel withdraw from the territory it had seized since the fall of Assad. And again, Katz, the Israeli defense minister, said in a statement that these attacks were part of their policy to ensure demilitarization of southern Syria, and that any attempt by Syrian forces or militant groups to establish a presence in what Israel was now deeming its security zone would be met with hostility and fire. And so, again, just like Hamas, the Syrian government has called for the international community to step in to put pressure on Israel to stop the bombings and its aggression. But Netanyahu, in his public comments, has singled out 3 provinces in Syria where Israel is not going to tolerate, in quotes, Syrian forces, and on you know there have been protests and demonstrations in the streets in Syria against this. So again, another site where there is sort of simmering tensions, and another site where Israel is continuing to engage in inflammatory behavior that involves occupation of another state's territory. So again, 2 other places to kind of keep in mind and also to factor in terms of what the appetite is for Israel to continue the ceasefire agreement with Hamas in Gaza. Um, Maybe one other thing just to mention, and probably the only other thing I was able to sort of get to this week was just the ICC and Biden. For the first, this article in Zateo just mentions that for the first time ever, a U.S.-based organization has formally asked the International Criminal Court to investigate a former U.S. president for possible complicity in war crimes and crimes against humanity. It's 172 pages submitted by Democracy for the Arab World Now or Dawn. And it also includes allegations against Secretary of State Antony Blinken, former Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, in aiding and abetting Israeli war crimes in Gaza. And so it details how U.S. officials provided, military and diplomatic support to Israel despite being aware that the aid was being used to commit war crimes. For which ICC warrants were already issued against Netanyahu and Gallant. Um, and, it also says that all three, Biden, Blinken, and Austin, ignored and justified the overwhelming evidence of war crimes, even overruling their own staff recommendations to halt weapons transfers to Israel, and doubling down by providing further and unconditional military support to Israel. So, another thing to kind of keep an eye on, but part of, I think, in conjunction with the other court cases that we know have been filed, we can think about the taxpayer suit that we recently discussed here on the program, and then the lawsuit supported by CCR that we talked to and also had demonstrations around last February. And in addition to, all sorts of extensive information and data being compiled by international aid groups and the UN itself, there's quite an extensive amount of information supporting the complicity of the U.S. government, and particularly this presidential administration in war crimes. So, okay, so there's probably more that I didn't get to. Samar had texted me, something about Israel swapping sides on Ukraine to appease Trump, and there's a lot going on today. Even just before getting on, the shouting match today between J.D. Vance and Zelensky at the White House. I think we'll follow up with some of that next week, and then also the spat between the Anti-Defamation League and Betar, the far right um, um, Zionist organization that has been harassing Palestine Solidarity folks here in the U.S. So hopefully we'll follow up with some of that next week. In the meantime, I just wanted to kind of remind everybody to, keep an eye on the AROC calendar and events that are coming up. And of course, to stay connected to the PSAs by texting PSA to 833-633-0604. And finally, the PAL Media Tracker, which Samar set up, which I think is a great resource to stay connected on all this, particularly when I'm not fully up to speed on everything. But thanks again for everyone's patience. We are glad to have everyone here. I will be actually interviewing a couple of aid workers this week, and there'll be a pre-recorded segment with a couple of folks who are doing aid work in Gaza right now, including having, knock on wood, Samar back next week to do a full PSA. So, yeah, thanks for sticking with us, and look forward to having you all with us again next week.